Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us from North and South America. I am Roddy Miller, CEO of Ideas for Leaders, and I'm delighted that you can be with us today for this latest in our increasingly regular series of webinars with leading business school faculty. Dilip Soman is Professor of Marketing and the Corus Chair of Communication Strategy at the University of Toronto's prestigious Rotman School of Management. Dilip's main focus of research is on behavioral economics, and so is for us here at Ideas for Leaders absolutely on target in our focus of generating behavioral change in organizations to enhance their productivity. Behavioral economics has become a central discipline for management change since Daniel Kahneman and Emil Tversky started researching decision-making processes back in the late 1960s. With the publication of Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow in 2011, however, the topic has become very mainstream. But while the concept of behavioral economics is now widely understood, its practice and nuances are still only beginning to be adopted. So we're very honoured to have Dilip with us today, as his research and practice is very much at the forefront of this area. Dilip has just returned from the UK, where he's worked with the Behavioural Insights team that started life in the UK government's Cabinet Office, the so-called Nudge Unit. And he also worked with the Harvard-based Idea 42 group, which designs scalable solutions for societal problems across the globe. At Rotman, Dilip is leading a new program on customer-focused marketing, which will run in spring of next year, to provide participants with greater insight into customer behaviour. And it's with that focus that I'll shortly hand over to Dilip to share his thinking with us. Just before I do so, however, I'd like to say that the key to our Ideas for Leaders webinars is not just the excellent content we have shared with us, but also the interactive question and answer sessions that follow. Dilip will speak for the next 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from you. Please do use the panel to send in questions both during Dilip's presentation and at the end, and we'll select from those some questions for Dilip to explore. And finally, if you'd like to tweet about the webinar, please use the hashtag #LastMile. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Dilip.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. What I'd like to do for the next 20-25 minutes is to talk a little bit about the concept of the last mile, and I'll spend a few minutes explaining exactly what I mean by that. But before I jump into the last mile, let me make a couple of quick remarks to preface my commentary today. A lot of what I'm going to say is applicable for both the not-for-profit world as well as for the for-profit business enterprise. The second comment I'd like to make is that I'm trained as an engineer and I've studied economics and behavioral science for the past 20-25 years. And what I try and do is to put in some sort of an engineering lens on the notion of system and system change, and thinking through human behavior as a fundamental engineering process that one could manage and that one could influence. So having said that, there are three questions that I'd like to address in today's webinar. The first one is, what is the premise of the last mile? What do we mean by the last mile? The second one has to do with the notion of behavior change. What does it mean to actually think of a system of behavior change, and what are different ways of thinking about behavior change? And finally, what do organizations need to do to be successful in the behavioral insights game? Let me start off with the first one. If you've ever taken a long drive on an expressway, you know exactly what the last mile problem is. Think about a drive from upstate New York to Boston, Massachusetts. You're on the Interstate 90, or think about the M4 in England, and hopefully the highway flows well. You can zip along at speeds of 100 kilometers per hour, and everything goes well till the time that you see a sign like the one that you see in this picture, Meadowvale Road, 1 kilometer. When you exit the highway, there are things that happen on the streets that you don't fully anticipate. There's somebody making a left turn that blocks up the highway, there's local construction, and what you'll notice is that the last mile or so of your journey home is perhaps the most inefficient as compared to the highway experience. And when we think about value creation in organizations, I think there's pretty much a similar metaphor to be drawn through what the last mile and the first mile is. When organizations think about serving customers, their first mile strategies include innovation, new product development, thinking through corporate strategy. The last mile is where the rubber meets the road. The last mile is when consumers come to your websites, into your retail stores, and just talk to your customer service representatives. And it's typically the last mile that organizations tend to falter at. So what are some examples of last mile challenges that we see in organizations? Here's one. Why does brand love not always translate into brand purchases? We've seen a number of market research reports that tell you that customers are delighted with your product, they think it's absolutely amazing, but we just don't see the uptakes in retail stores. Likewise in the service industry, why do consumers who are delighted with service never return? It's been a big challenge for all kinds of service industries, including hotels, vacation destinations, golf resorts, that they find customers reporting extremely high levels of satisfaction, but that they never see again. Why are new product and innovation success rates so low? Turns out they're as low as 4 or 5%, depending on how you define success. And you would imagine that over time, that those new product success rates will improve as we have learned a little bit about customer preferences, as we have learned a little bit about innovation processes and manufacturing. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And finally, why do so many welfare schemes that governments and welfare organizations put out get such low take-up rates? These are all important questions, and these are all last mile challenge questions. And I want to make the claim that organizations spend way too much time thinking about the first mile and way too little thinking about the last mile. And one of the big reasons for that is that the last mile is not a problem of technology, it's not a problem of innovation systems, it's not a problem of market expertise, it is a problem of psychology. And at the last mile, we are dealing with lots of our stakeholders, customers, investors, and as we know, customer behavior is inherently much more unpredictable than a lot of the corporate environments that we deal with. So having said that, let me bridge the gap between the last mile and psychology, and in particular some of the remarks that Roddy made up front about behavioral economics. And before I do that, I want to make a quick remark about the notion of consumer behavior and rationality. Most of you have read books which make the point that consumers are not rational, or that they don't behave in their own self-interest. And the term irrationality is described or used often to describe consumer behavior. And I'm actually not sure that irrationality is the right label to put on it. Just because consumers don't behave the laws of economics doesn't mean that they are irrational. They're actually just being human. And to me, expecting consumers to be rational is perhaps a stronger form of irrationality. And so we need to think about a theory of the last mile that embraces what real people do in real settings and builds a theory that will then allow us to understand how their actions can be influenced. The good news is that there are 3 simple principles that explain much of consumer behavior. Principle number 1 is that context is everything. You change the context and people's preferences change. Principle number 2 has to do with procrastination. The idea that all of us want to be good human beings, we want to lose weight, we want to exercise, we want to save more for our future, and we want to spend more time with our children, but not today. And the reason we don't do it today is because today is busy, but tomorrow turns out is going to be rosier than today is going to be. And as we know, tomorrow is just like today, and so we tend to procrastinate all of the good things that we want to do because life gets in the way. The third simple principle that explains human behavior is the principle of inertia. The idea that human beings are cognitively lazy and that unless they are pushed to make active choices, they will actually not do so. Let me give you an example of one of these principles, and that has to do with the importance of context. It probably comes as no surprise to most people that the most popular size of coffee sold in coffee shops is the medium size of coffee. It turns out about 74% of all coffee sales are in the medium cup. But what's interesting is that most people don't know how much coffee is in the medium cup of coffee. And the size, the number of ounces of coffee in medium cups of coffee is different across coffee shops. Several years back, I did an experiment in which I presented people with 3 coffee cups, 8 ounces, 10 ounces, and 12 ounces, and saw that most people preferred the medium option. And when we asked them why, they would give us a Goldilocks kind of a response. The little one has too little, the big one has too much, the one in the middle is just right. After a few weeks, we added 2 ounces to each size. And now we had 10 ounces, 12 ounces, and 14 ounces. Lo and behold, the new medium became the more popular size. And when we asked people, in fact, the same people, as to why they chose this size, they blinked and looked at us as if we were asking them a completely bizarre question. And they said something along the lines of, didn't I just tell you 3 weeks ago that the one in the middle is just right, the one on the left has too much, the one on the right has too little. The interesting point of this example is not only the fact that context influences choice, but that human beings are completely unaware of the effect of context on choice. Here's another example in the world of marketing that illustrates the power of understanding psychology. This is an alarm clock called Clocky. As we know, when we go to bed at 10 p.m., we have every good intention of waking up tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., perhaps to play a game of tennis or get some exercise or do some work. But when 6 a.m. rolls around and your alarm clock rings, there is something called a snooze button, so that the new you, the new person, the person that's now dealing with the alarm clock at 6 a.m., basically forgets their own preferences from the previous night and can snooze and go back to bed. But not with Clocky. What Clocky does is it can actually jump off tables and it can run away from you at the time that the alarm starts ringing. And it has a sensor which allows it to hide under surfaces, which in my case might be under my bed. So by the time I find up Clocky and can silence the alarm, I am so awake that I probably will never go back to bed. So another interesting example of how human psychology could be used, in this case, in the domain of product design. Here's another principle. A penny saved is a penny earned. This was something that I was taught growing up, and it turns out that that is not the case, that human beings treat money separately as a function of how it is earned and how it is budgeted. For example, if you go into a store planning to spend $100 on a set of products, that money is psychologically already pre-committed to purchase, which means that if you get an unexpected discount and the products only cost you $70, chances are good that you will find something else to spend the $30 on. And so if you were a good retailer, you would organize your displays such that whenever you have a sale on certain items, there are other items conveniently located that are priced at the difference between the regular price and the markdown price. And finally, choice. We've always grown up with the notion that giving people more choice is always good, and it turns out that that too is often not the case. Here are 2 menus from a restaurant. The one on the right has 6 entree options. The one on the left has 16. You would expect that when you give people 16 entree options, that you would see more choice or more variety seeking, simply because people have more options to choose from. Our research shows that indeed you actually find the opposite effect, that when you give people too many choices, it backfires. They don't know how to choose, and so they end up eating the same standard 2 or 3 options. So what does all of this mean for consumer behavior and for the last mile? When we want to get people to do something, buy a product, sign up for a welfare program, encash a check, open an envelope, or open a retirement account, there are a lot of obstacles that come up, a lot of walls that come up. And these walls aren't real walls, they're psychological walls. They're psychological walls caused by inertia, by procrastination, and by simple context effects. And what that essentially means is that there is a lot of power in simple contextual things that what could influence consumer behavior with. So let me start off with one such example, the power of forms. In much of what we do, we require consumers or our stakeholders to fill up forms. On the left-hand side of this screen, you will see an organ donation form that was used by the province of Ontario to get people to commit to donating organs for scientific research or for transplants. The form was printed on standard A4 size paper, and it turns out that organ donation rates were fairly low. The form on the right-hand side is half the size, but it is printed on a thicker cardstock. It's simpler to fill, and it is also easier to fill while standing in a line waiting for other services. So simply by changing the form, the province was able to increase the level of organ donations significantly. This is just one example of ways in which forms can be simplified or information can be presented to change the way in which your consumers react. Likewise, think about forms for scholarship applications or retirement funds, which tend to be incredibly complex. Just the act of simplifying the form and perhaps pre-populating part of that form with information that is already on your computer databases increases the likelihood that people will actually complete the form and follow through on whatever action is necessary. Here's another example based on the work of one of my colleagues, Tanjim Hussain, and this has to do with the manner in which information is framed and presented. Tanjim and his colleagues did an experiment in a factory in China, where the factory was offering workers a productivity bonus for achieving certain levels of production on a given day. The factory told workers that if they achieved that certain level of production, they would earn an extra 320 renminbi above and beyond their standard pay. Tanjim and his colleagues changed the framing of the message ever so slightly. And for some of the workers, they were told that you could potentially already earn 320 extra renminbi, but if you fail to meet the target, then the 320 would be deducted from their salary. They found that when the information about the productivity bonus was presented as a potential loss rather than a potential gain, workers were more productive. There are other similar examples of how the last mile intervention with information framing has resulted in good outcomes. A few years back, we were working to try and get people to upgrade their furnaces and their air conditioning to newer energy efficient appliances. Half the households were presented with information in which they were told about how much they would save if in fact on their energy bills if they upgraded to the new furnace. The other half were told how much they would lose per month if they upgraded to the new energy efficient appliances. And what we found was that households that received the information as potential losses were twice as likely to want to upgrade than those who received the information as potential gains. Here's another simple last mile intervention, which is to convert passive choices into active choices. Let's imagine you're trying to get people to get a flu shot at the end of the fall in preparation for flu season. Poonam Anand Keller, who's a professor at Dartmouth University, and her colleagues did a study with an organization that offered free flu clinics as part of the health package for their employees. This organization normally sent out an email in October and November informing all of their employees that there was a free flu clinic in the atrium and that they could come in at any point in time to get a flu shot. Under those circumstances, about 42% of employees got a flu shot. In a second version of the email, employees received the same exact information, but then were posed a question at the end. Will you get a flu shot this season? That mere act of asking the question at the end of the email increased the likelihood that people would get a flu shot by about 8 or 9%. In a third version of the email, there was the same information, the same question, but instead of a yes versus no option, employees read, yes, because I care for the welfare of myself and my family, versus no, because I don't care. And under those circumstances, a further 8 or 9% went ahead and got a flu shot. The bottom line is that during the course of our day, there are many passive decisions that we need to make, and simply prompting people to make a decision with a pointed question will increase the likelihood that they will actually make the smart choice. And as a final example, I talk about a research that I did in India several years back, trying to get low-income construction laborers to save more money for their children's education. In the past, banks had worked with these laborers using financial literacy programs and taught them the importance of saving, and had even gone so far as to draw up individual monthly savings plan for these workers. Keep in mind that these were workers that received incomes in cash, and as a result, it was much more easy to spend the money, unlike in the global West, where we tend to get our incomes deposited directly into our bank accounts. With the financial literacy program in place, a lot of workers understood the importance of saving and even knew how much they should be saving, but still failed to save any amount. Our intervention was simple. We took a white envelope, marked it savings, and put aside the target savings amount in cash into the envelope at the beginning of each week, and simply asked the worker if they could try and save to everything that was in the envelope. We went a step further and put photographs of their children on the envelope. And putting those pictures increased the likelihood of them saving even further. A simple psychological intervention did much more than a financial literacy intervention, or perhaps even a banking intervention could have done, to try and get people to save more money. So what does all of this mean for behavior change? I think there are 4 ways to think about behavior change. Let's imagine there is a hypothetical choice A and choice B, and you are trying to get people who are currently choosing A to switch to B. The first thing you could do to engineer that switch is to restrict. You could simply ban A, or if you were a manufacturer, you could withdraw product A from the shelf. The second option in which you could change behavior is to provide people with incentives. You could tax A, you could give a discount on B, you could think about subsidies, and so on and so forth. The third approach to behavior change is persuasion or advertising, giving people information about option B. And the fourth is simply nudging people, which is changing the context such that perhaps B might be the default option, and that is another way to think about behavior change. Now, I talk about these 4 approaches towards behavior change, not so much because I would like to see one or the other, but that it is an important way to think about how best to organize our framework for behavior change along these 4 dimensions. And in my own work, as well as the work of many companies and organizations that I've worked with, the best approaches are the ones that might use a hybrid of these 4 different times. As an engineer, when I think about the approach to behavior change, there are 2 broad ways in which we want to think about how we can help consumers make better choices: the equip approach and the pad approach. If human behavior is deviant from what we want it to be, if people are making a choice that is different from what we want that choice to be, we can equip people with the right decision-making tools to help them make a better choice. These tools could be decision support systems or apps or anything that can give people the right information as well as the right model to make the best choice. Or we could pad the environment. We could design the context in such a way that even if people make the wrong choice, they don't actually have a really disastrous consequence. We're working right now on a project on consumer privacy. And the issue is, how do we protect consumers' data online? The EQUIP approach would say, think about a consumer privacy literacy program that will help people make better choices online. The PAD approach would say, try and set the defaults on every search engine or every app to the safest possible so that should they not make the right choices, they still don't end up sharing too much data online. Also, as a process, in the book, The Last Mile, I talk about a 6-stage process where we think about the consumer journey and what we can do to make that journey much more efficient and convert interest into trial. The 6 steps involve auditing the decision-making process, mapping it out, thinking about where the leaks are, prioritizing which leak to fix, bringing in your behavioral tools to plug the leak, and then testing. And more information on all of this is in the book as well as some of our working papers. Given that I have about a minute, I would like to start wrapping up by talking about some prescriptive advice. In influencing consumer decision-making, everything matters. But fixing everything at the same time can be problematic. And so it's important to be able to prioritize exactly which contextual elements to start addressing and in what sequence. Maps and consumer journeys are central to a good theory of the last mile. Most of us have good data on our customers nowadays, in particular businesses that do transactions online or interact with their consumers online have a rich history of data on consumers. And that data can help think through exactly where the bottlenecks are and where the leaks in the system are. So harnessing your data well is critical to a good theory of the last mile. Advice number 3, look for quick wins and easy interventions. We often have situations where we already have existing touch points with our customers. Use those touch points well and redesign those touch points rather than creating additional touch points. And look for changes in behavior that you can detect quickly. Number 4, there is a market for self-control. Develop it. We talked about Clocky, the alarm clock, but there are many, many other domains in which consumers are looking for help, in which they can allow their future selves to behave exactly as their present selves wanted. Number 5, timing is key. Interventions delivered at the wrong times will not work as you intended them to be, and so timing of the intervention is a critical variable that we need to understand. There are 3 activities in harnessing behavioral insights. Translation, which is looking at the academic work and converting that into practical insights. Auditing, which is looking at your own customer-related processes and identifying where the bottlenecks are. And finally, intervention and testing. And finally, there can be no evidence-based interventions without evidence. It is critically important to run trials and to run experiments to make sure that you can document that all of your interventions and changes that you've made at the last mile are working the way that you want it to work. I'm going to hand it back to Roddy, but before I do so, I will just leave you with 2 resources that I could point you to. There is a massive open online class that I teach called Behavioral Economics in Action, BE101X, on the edX platform, and a lot of the information that I talked about is explained in greater depth there. Or if you're in the Toronto area, you can always sign up for one of our customer-focused marketing programs. I think our next edition is in March 2016, and the information on that is there as well. Over to you, Roddy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dilip. That was fantastic and a great, a whirlwind introduction to this topic, but I think the insights are really valuable. I'm hopeful that we are going to get some good questions coming up, but let me just kick off with a couple of thoughts that occur to me. And how expert, obviously, if if you're immersed in it and have real expertise and research knowledge such as yourself, that is a huge advantage. But how able do you think people who don't have that background are to adapt products and services that they're involved with, so that they can benefit from some of these insights?
So it's a great question, and I think it's a question I get asked a lot. And I think I have two responses to that question. The first response is that a lot of the science here is an empirical science. It's all about collecting data, running trials, and using the evidence to inform decisions that you make about the customer experience at the last mile. And so even if you don't have the fundamental insight into psychology, having somebody on the outside that can advise you on what the psychology would say, and then designing a system of experimentation in place that will allow you to try some things in a low-cost environment, maybe in a lab, and then scaling them up would be perhaps the easiest way to start implementing some of these approaches. The second response is that, as a lot of people have remarked, human psychology is remarkably intuitive, and it's because all of us are humans and we live that psychology. And so all one really needs is a framework to think about the different elements of consumer decision making. So the three elements I talked about: context, procrastination, and the idea of inertia are central to my book. But you can also think about sort of, what are the different domains in which we need to understand human psychology. In the book, The Last Mile, I talk about the psychology of time, the psychology of money, the psychology of making decisions, and finally emotions and their role in decision making. And once you have a basic understanding of those four domains of inquiry, as well as a process in place, which again the book equips people to do, then I think the rest is all a matter of developing the ability to see your customer-related processes as an engineering system and trying to fix the leaks, and that's the metaphor that we use consistently.
So, I mean, it takes that sort of engineering approach then in order sort of, you need to understand, I suppose, the structure in order to know where it's not working optimally.
Absolutely. And I think that's where your data sets can also help massively. So when we think about sort of, if you have an online business, you've got a lot of data in terms of, where your customers land and what % of them go to the product information page and what % of them buy. And that's a flowchart right there that you can start mapping out and identify where the leaks are happening. But you're right, it's all about developing that mindset. People in sales often talk about a funnel, but thinking about all of your customer interactions as a funnel, where over time you might be losing people along the way. Figure out where you lose them and plug those using behavioral interventions.
Okay. We got a question here, but please do keep sending some questions in. Be great to get some good discussion going. In terms of internal change projects, would this approach support to embed the projects, as it feels like there are strong, as there's a strong connection there for internal change projects as well as external change projects in use of the last mile?
I agree, and I think sort of again, when I talk about the last mile, in sort of my remarks today, we talked about the skin of the organization being the part where you interface with your customers, but the principles are exactly the same where, when you think about internal change projects, when you think about business-to-business marketing, any project where you have a interface with some stakeholder, be it investors, be it internal employees, be it other businesses, the ideas are pretty much the same. And so, in the book, I give a few examples of where this has been applied to non-marketing contexts, but you're spot on. The ideas are exactly the same, and you want to think about those stakeholders in pretty much the same way as you might think about your customers in developing this approach.
I suppose in many ways an internal change project almost might be more powerful because you sort of understand the consumer end that much more closely, and you got better data on the consumer end.
You do, and I think you also have a better understanding of internal processes because oftentimes when you're looking at outward-facing processes, you often don't know what's happening in the retail store. As a manufacturer of a branded product, you typically turn over your merchandise to a retailer, and then you have very little insight into what's going on at that last mile, whereas for internal processes, you have a lot more data and a lot more insight into what the exact selling process looks like.
Okay. Another question in here asking about the difference between operating the TLM approach in a physical world as opposed to a socially influenced digital world. Are there different levels of nudging you can do in one or the other?
So the fundamental difference between the two is the power of peers or social influence. That works wonderfully well in the offline world as well, but on the online world, you just have a lot more leverage with which to communicate that power. So let me give you an example of a project that was done by the UK Nudge Unit several years back, trying to get citizens to pay their taxes on time. And so what they would do is they would send out an email or a letter in the physical world from Her Majesty's government, essentially encouraging you to pay your taxes on time. That letter wasn't always successful. And so what they started doing was that they started introducing a line up front which told people something to the effect of 90% of people pay their taxes on time, so should you. And that was an interesting nudge because people now had a peer reference group and they were able to then benchmark themselves against that group. They did a second version of that trial where it says 90% of people in your city pay their taxes on time versus 90% of people in your community pay their taxes on time. And they found that as your social connectedness improved, the likelihood that you would be influenced by your peers goes up dramatically. Now what we've been doing some studies here where we try to replicate those kinds of things in an online world, and we find that the potential for online peer influence is significantly and dramatically greater. It's not about the numbers, it's about having somebody else like you that is exhibiting the same behavior. And I think social networking agencies like Facebook and Twitter know exactly how that works. And so if you can get someone like you to say that they're engaging in a certain behavior, purchasing a certain product, going to vacation to a certain destination, chances are good that you would do the same. So on that particular dimension, the social world offers a lot more opportunities. But again, the principles remain the same. The theories remain the same. I think people behave pretty much the same way. When it comes to the basic psychological processes that they follow, the details are different.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions here that are going to put you on the spot to come up with some nudges. There's one here that says, on the issue of having too much choice, a pertinent example is the recruitment systems of today, where employees receive hundreds of applications for each position advertised. Automated filtering methods are not effective, and neither the employers nor the potential employees are better off because of that. Can you offer any insight in how you might be able to adapt a filtering process, a sort of self-filtering process, I suppose?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we actually did work with a partner here trying to address a similar question, and that wasn't so much a recruiting process as a volunteer search process. And one of the things we found was that a lot of the position or the postings for volunteer recruitment are relatively vague and open-ended, and they don't ask people pointed questions about assessing their own fit with the organization. And so what we did was we tried to create a system where there was a short checklist of 5 questions of things that would make you particularly suitable to this particular organization. And as a result, we were able to cut down the number of people expressing interest to a smaller number, but also a more qualified number, because people were now, applicants were now able to sort of develop a better sense of exactly what sort of fit they would have with that organization. So I'm not sure if that's something that can be applied directly to recruitment processes. But again, the idea is that rather than getting people to think of a job application as a lottery ticket, if there was a system in which they could be helped to assess the fit and or suitability better, that would help, I think, in narrowing down the set.
Okay, and as a sort of follow-on question from that, which has also come in, how would you suggest we build this capability in our leaders? I mean, can you build that the capability to be good at this? I mean, and taking that previous question as an example, I mean, how would a recruiter sort of know what kind of questions are good to ask to do that filtering process?
Yeah, so I mean, let me address that question more broadly, and then perhaps we can apply that to the recruiting system, which is, in terms of behavioral insights more broadly, what can we do to make sure that leaders are better attuned to the processes and systems? So one of the big sort of challenges that I faced when I started developing this work 10, 15 years back was the notion of pushback. Which was, for every piece of data you would present to a manager, you would get a story of a counterexample. And therefore, I realized that the best way you could counter the counterexample is to present even more data. And so my approach has always been to think about empirically based solutions where you can run a trial in a laboratory setting or a small online panel, collect the data, convince people to make one small change, document the results again, and then iterate towards the broader set of solutions. And to me, one of the best insights from human psychology is that when people are presented with hard numbers, they are much more likely to be convinced about the approach than simply by sort of hand waving and thinking about, here's what the theory says from psychology. And so to me, it's all about an empirical approach and developing a family of interventions over time that can result in overall success.
Okay. Well, I think we've got sort of time for just one more question before our time is up. It seems to have gone very fast, but here's another one for your insight, which is Disney World just banned selfie sticks, and Russia has a campaign going on taking selfies more safely. For example, not while driving, which mind boggles. What might work in the last mile in these efforts?
So let me make a broad comment on banning more generally, and I think a lot of people over the last few years have taken flack for banning stuff. So 2 years back, New York Mayor Bloomberg decided to ban large sizes of sugary drinks. And people hated that. I mean, he was the subject of much negative media and social media ribbing and so on and so forth. And I think in that case, there was a simple intervention, which is some of the work that I talk about in the book. It's called partitioning, the idea that if you signal to people that they're consuming more than they should, then they're more likely to slow down consumption on their own accord. Now, I actually don't know much about the selfie ban in Disneyland, I'm going to confess, but rather than banning, if there is a way in which you could harness peer effects or somehow give people a substitute or a different idea on how they could take those pictures, that might be the way to go. Let me also use this question to make another important point that I write about in the book a lot, which has to do with the idea that I'm not advocating nudging because I think nudging is the best approach to change behavior. In fact, far from it. So some combination of changing the context and incentives is the right way to think about doing this. Your processes have to be golden. And if you nudge people towards a poor process, you actually end up sort of, developing a system where you encourage negative behavior. And as they say in the CRM world, that simply using CRM to automate a bad process makes the problem worse. And so it's all about making sure customers have an alternative to the thing that you're banning. So if you're ever going to ban anything, make sure you give people a choice, because if you don't, then you're always going to get flag for it.
Fantastic. I mean, that does flag up one little issue. That I suppose it is possible also that this can be used for negative purposes, and getting people to do things they don't necessarily want to do. Have you come across examples of that?
There often are, and I think like any other tool, you run into the risk that people use the tool for things that you don't want them to. That doesn't prevent us from inventing new tools or describing them. But to me, the big sort of opportunity for behavioral insights related work is the idea that all of us know that there are things we should be doing that we don't do. And that's low-hanging fruit for marketers and businesses to, to apply the nudging techniques to. So if you want to get people to save more money, everybody knows they want to save more, and everybody knows they should be exercising more and eating more healthy food. Just providing people with the right tools to be able to do what they want to do, to me, would be a good step one in terms of applying the behavioral insights world.
Fantastic. I think that's a great note for us to close on, that a lot of it's about self-awareness as well, presumably, so which fits very nicely back into the whole leadership cycle and that we focus on here. Dilip, thank you very much. That was really interesting and insightful, and we are keen to learn more about it. So I'll be looking at some of those links that you put through and encourage people to do so as well. That'd be great. But thank you very much for your time. It's difficult online to show our appreciation, but I'm sure there's a round of applause going on out there. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for joining us as well. And we hope you enjoyed that, and we will be sending out a recording of this to you all. So look out for that in the next few days. Brilliant. Until next time, thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.